In the spring of 1873, so the old story goes, a lone lawman riding through the hill country of the nation found 17 bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a dying campfire. Each man had been shot once between the eyes. Each man was found holding, in a cold stiffened hand, a single playing card pulled from the same deck. The lawman counted those cards twice before he understood what he was looking at. The dead were bounty men, agency riders, and lawmen from his own office. Men who had ridden out together 6 weeks earlier with one job: bring in, dead or alive, the man the newspapers of the day had taken to calling the Black Devil of the Red River. They had failed the way every posse before them had failed. And the cards in their hands spelled out a message in a code the lawman recognized on sight but could not read. A code that, as the legend tells it, would not be understood for another 4 decades, long after every person who knew its meaning was gone, buried in unmarked graves scattered across 3 states. What that lawman did not know, what almost no one outside a handful of families would ever fully know, was that the man they had been hunting had once been sold at auction as property, for the price of a good horse, to a cotton planter who branded his own initials into an 11-year-old boy's shoulder before sending him into the fields. Before we go further into the story of Elijah Cross, and the strange, sprawling, half-remembered band of outcasts who rode with him, stick around. If tales like this are the kind of thing you love, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of story that mostly survives now in fragments, in old songs, in family whispers, in a legend passed hand to hand down through generations of people who had their own reasons to keep it close and quiet. Nobody ever wanted this one told outside the family circle. Tonight, we're going to tell it anyway. To understand how a boy born into bondage could become, in the telling and retelling of an entire region, the most feared and most beloved outlaw of the post-war frontier, you have to understand the country that shaped him first. The war ended in the spring of 1865. But along the ragged western edge of what had been the Confederacy, where Texas met the nation, and the nation met Arkansas, the war didn't really end. It just changed its clothes. The Union Army pulled most of its soldiers back east to occupy the deeper South, and it left behind a territory nearly the size of a small country with barely enough federal lawmen to police a single county, let alone all of it. Into that emptiness poured everyone the war had broken loose: Confederate holdouts who refused to lay down arms, Army deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, displaced raiding parties pushed off their old hunting grounds, vaqueros run out by the new cattle money, and, more than any other group, tens of thousands of newly freed men and women walking west with nothing but the clothes on their backs, because the world they'd known had become a killing ground for any black person caught alone after dark. There was a town near the center of all that churn, a rough little settlement the legend calls Redbird Crossing, about 40 miles north of the river. In the fall of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same handful of coin. The streets were dirt. The buildings were thrown up out of green cottonwood that warped as it dried, so that every door and window sat a little crooked, like the whole town had been built by someone who'd forgotten how doors and windows were supposed to fit together. There were 3 saloons, 2 of them run by the same sharp-eyed merchant, a man the old stories call Push Foley, who had gotten rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war and saw no reason at all to stop now that the soldiers were gone. There was one trading post, kept by a Scotsman named Ewan Cargill, who was known to keep a shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top of it, and to reach for whichever one was closer depending on the argument. There was a livery, a blacksmith, and a squat little adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse whenever the regional tribal police happened to ride through, which, as that first hard year after the war wore on, happened less and less. The graveyard on the rise behind the burned-out mission at the edge of town had grown by nearly 50 graves in 18 months. Fewer than 10 of those belonged to people who died of anything you could call natural causes. The rest, as folks in that country used to say, died of lead poisoning, or rope fever, or the kind of accident that involves a knife, somebody's back, and a moonless night. Into that town, on a cold morning in November of 1866, walked a black man of about 20. He was tall, well over 6 feet, lean as a coyote, dressed in a worn Union cavalry coat with a corporal's chevron still stitched to the sleeve, a wide slouch hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. A repeating carbine rode slung across his back. 2 revolvers sat at his hips in a cross-drawer rig he'd cut for himself out of harness leather, and a long knife was tucked into his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles alone, through country where a black man traveling by himself was, more often than not, considered fair game for anybody who wanted his weapons or his life. Nobody had touched him. The reasons why would become clear to the people of Redbird Crossing soon enough. His name, he told Ewan Cargill when he stepped into the trading post to buy salt pork and coffee, was Elijah Cross. He'd served 3 years in a colored infantry regiment out of Kansas, fought and bled at more than one battle whose name the old-timers still swapped over campfires, and been mustered out with a discharge paper, a promised back pay voucher the Army never made good on, and a brand on his left shoulder that would never fade. Cargill looked him over once, noted the way Cross had positioned himself with his back to the corner and his eyes on the door, and recognized, the way old frontier men sometimes recognized each other, the look of someone who had already decided he would never be taken alive. Cargill counted out the goods without a word of trouble and, as the story is always told, threw in a small sack of dried apples besides. Years later, when Cargill was an old man and almost everyone else in this story was long gone, he was said to have told a traveling newspaperman that he'd known, the moment that young man walked through his door, that the country was about to change. He just had no idea how much. The pieces of Elijah Cross's early life, pieced together slowly, over generations, mostly through family memory rather than any official record, sketched the outline of a childhood built to break a person, and somehow, through some mixture of luck and sheer stubborn will, it produced the opposite. He was born, the story holds, around 1846 on a cotton plantation in the deep South, the property of a planter named Josiah Ashcombe, who ran several hundred enslaved people under what he liked to call scientific management, meaning he had read the agricultural pamphlets of his day and decided that productivity improved when families were broken apart, children sold off once they reached working age, on the theory that people without kin nearby were less likely to run and more likely to keep their heads down. Cross's mother, remembered in family telling only by the name Hannah, was sold south when Elijah was 9 years old. He never saw her again. His father's identity was never firmly known. Family legend holds he may have been a free blacksmith who was allowed brief, tightly supervised visits, and who vanished from any record in the early 1850s, whether dead or fled, no one could ever say. At 11, Elijah was sold again, to a planter further north, the man whose initials would be burned into the boy's shoulder, and who treated him with the kind of casual cruelty that, in that time and place, wasn't considered remarkable at all. He ran at 15, in 1861, slipping away during the chaos of the war's opening months, making his way through the swamps to Union lines, where he eventually found a recruiting station enlisting black soldiers into what would become one of the first colored infantry regiments. He served 3 years with distinction. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain who, family legend says, later wrote of him as the most quietly sharp young man he had ever met, a young man with a memory that forgot nothing and an instinct for tactics that, in any army that let black men wear an officer's insignia, would have made him a commander. That army did not exist. Elijah was recommended for sergeant 3 separate times and denied all 3, on grounds that had nothing to do with his soldiering. What happened over the following 18 months, in the wild borderland between the rivers, is remembered now only in pieces, in oral histories still quietly told in black and native families across that country, though these days, the story goes, they're told a little more quietly than they used to be. Old grudges in that part of the world have a way of outliving the people who first dug them. By the spring of 1868, Elijah Cross had gathered around him a band of riders so unlikely in its makeup that, when the first reports reached the authorities, they simply refused to believe it. There were 7 black freedmen, all of them former soldiers like Cross himself, among them a sharp-eyed Tennessee man named Titus Merrow, who could read a trail like other men read newsprint. There were 4 riders from a Comanche band led by a man called Tall Elk, who had lost his family to a raid years before and saw the new alliance as a continuation of an old war, fought now by different means. There were three brothers from the borderlands, Diego, Rafael, and Teodoro Serrano, whose father had been hanged by a vigilante mob, and who brought with them the hard, practiced discipline of a family long used to feuds. There were two former Confederate raiders, a Missourian named Silas Tatum and a man from Kentucky named Gideon Hutton, who had ridden with guerrilla bands during the war and found no place left for themselves once it ended. There was an old freedman named Amos Reed, who had once been enslaved by a wealthy man of the nation before the war and now served the band as cook, scout, and quiet go-between with the tribal governments of the region. And there was a woman, the part of the story that, family legend insists, outsiders always found hardest to accept. A black woman of about 25, remembered in the old telling as Selah Vance, who had escaped a plantation at 15 and spent the war years working alongside a cavalry regiment, where she'd learned to shoot with either hand and read a map with the quick, cold instinct of a born tactician. She rode with the band as an equal. She planned more than a few of its boldest strikes. And by every account passed down, she was a woman of striking, severe beauty, with the kind of eyes that always seemed to be looking at something 100 yards past whatever was actually in front of her. The band did not steal cattle, and that, more than anything, was what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity out there, easily organized against, easily hunted down by the ranchers' associations. What Elijah Cross's people took was money, in amounts no outlaw band in that country had ever dared imagine. Their first major strike, in the spring of 1868, hit a payroll wagon belonging to a railroad company pushing its line west through the territory. The wagon carried close to $30,000 meant to pay construction crews, guarded by a dozen armed men, several of them professional agency riders brought in because trouble was expected. The story says the wagon was hit at 3 in the morning by a force the surviving guards swore numbered 30 riders, though Cross's whole band, by every account, never topped 20. The attack, as it's told, was over in minutes. A few guards were killed. The rest were disarmed and tied to trees, untouched otherwise, while the company's money, and only the company's money, disappeared east into a network of hidden caves that the freedmen in the band had used for shelter during the war. None of it was ever seen again. The survivors, once they were finally able to give a coherent account, described an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. No shouted demands. No warning shots. Just a sudden, total silence, the kind of silence, one guard was said to have put it, that falls over a forest the instant every small animal senses a predator has stepped inside it. The lead horses on the wagon dropped dead in their traces, brought down by 2 rifle shots fired from over 300 yards by marksmen nobody ever saw. Then riders emerged from the tree line on both sides of the road, moving at a slow walk, faces covered, guns held ready but not aimed at anyone in particular, the way a man holds a weapon when he's so sure of his own aim that threats feel unnecessary. A few guards who tried to draw were shot dead before their hands finished the motion. The rest raised their hands and were talked through the rest of it in a calm, almost schoolteacherly voice: dismount, unbuckle your gun belts, walk to the trees, hands behind the trunks. They were tied with cord already cut to length. They were searched, and, pointedly, anything personal, watches, rings, a little cash, was left untouched. Only the company's money went with the riders. One young guard, on his first assignment out west, was said to have broken down crying. According to the story, one of the masked riders climbed down, walked over, offered him a pull from a flask, patted his shoulder, and rode on. By dawn, when a passing freight wagon found them, the guards had been tied up for hours, and the only thing they could all agree on was that the men who'd hit them hadn't been ordinary outlaws. They'd been soldiers, the kind who had survived a war by getting better at killing than the men trying to kill them, and had simply decided, for reasons none of the guards could fathom, to keep going. What unsettled the agency that hired those guards more than the lost money was what they found when the men were finally cut loose. Each of them had a small scrap of paper pinned to his shirt, all reading the same line, in the same careful schoolmaster's hand. "We could have killed you. We chose not to. Tell your masters that next time, the choice may be different." The agency's leadership didn't know what to make of it. It had been founded decades earlier by a man with abolitionist roots, who in his younger years might well have understood exactly what Elijah Cross was doing better than almost anyone alive. But by 1868, that agency had become the private police force of the railroads and eastern banking interests, and its field agents were told, simply, to treat the Cross Band as an ordinary criminal conspiracy, bring them in alive if you can, dead if you can't. The agency assigned its sharpest man to the job, a former big city detective the legend remembers as Marcus Kane, a hard, methodical operator who understood almost immediately that this would be no ordinary manhunt. He arrived at the regional federal outpost in the summer of 1868, sat down with the marshal there, and asked a single question: how does a man hide 20 riders, several of them from a Comanche band, in country where every rancher and every passing teamster reports a strange face within a day? Neither man had an answer. It would take Kane 2 more years, and a great deal of blood, to find one. The answer, when it finally came into focus, would shake the authorities into a level of secrecy that kept the true shape of this story out of the newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Elijah Cross was not hiding at all. He was being protected, deliberately, quietly, by hundreds of ordinary people scattered across 3 states, who had each decided, for their own reasons, that whatever he was doing needed doing. The first hint of that network came when one of Kane's informants in a nearby town reported wagon-loads of supplies moving in and out of the mountain hideout for months, apparently with the knowing cooperation of the tribal police, who seemed content to look the other way. Kane pushed. 3 days later, that informant turned up dead in the middle of the main street, a single playing card pinned to his chest, the King of Spades. No one in town had seen a thing. When Kane threatened to bring in outside troops, the tribal leadership pointed, calmly and correctly, to their own government sovereignty under treaty, and told him no such force would be allowed to enter without consent that would not be given. The message was unmistakable: Cross had protection that went well beyond a handful of loyal outlaws. Kane wired his superiors a long report. The reply he got back was one of the strangest documents of its kind, instructing him to proceed, but with what it called particular discretion, in anything that might draw public attention. Somewhere in the leadership of that agency, someone understood that this wasn't a clean case of crime and punishment, and wasn't eager to bring the whole weight of the organization down on it without first knowing exactly what they'd be destroying. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, take a second and hit that like button, because stories like this one only find their way to more people when folks actually engage with them. Families who spent generations trying to keep a story like this quiet did a pretty good job of it. Every like, every comment, every share is what lets somebody else stumble onto it. And if you've got a theory of your own about where this is headed, drop it below, because what's coming is stranger and sadder than even Kane could have guessed. In the fall of 1868, the band struck again, a stagecoach carrying gold owed to the nation under old treaty terms, coin the government had finally agreed to pay out instead of the paper money tribal leaders had learned, the hard way, to refuse. The coach carried close to $20,000 in gold and was guarded by a full cavalry detachment. By the story's telling, the detachment was wiped out, 8 troopers killed in a single opening volley from both sides of the road, and the gold vanished. What made that robbery famous wasn't the theft. It was what came after. Within 2 weeks, nearly every freedman family across a wide stretch of the nation received, by means no investigator could ever trace, a small leather pouch holding exactly enough gold to account, almost dollar, for what had been taken, with a small remainder the families insisted had gone toward schoolbooks for the children. Investigators questioned family after family. None would say a word about who had left the pouches or how. Pressed, they only said the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and looked back at the agents with an expression that mixed politeness, patience, and a deep, ancient amusement the agents found impossible to crack. Marcus Kane understood exactly what he was looking at the moment he read those reports. Elijah Cross wasn't a thief, not really, not in the way the word was usually meant. He was something closer to a redistributor. An inverted version of an Old English legend, operating in a shattered post-war landscape where the government had failed, again and again, the very people it had just freed, while railroads and cattle money raced to grab up every acre and every dollar before anyone could organize to stop them. Cross, in other words, wasn't robbing the country. He was pushing back against it. By the spring of 1869, the band had carried out more than a dozen major operations, 2 more railroad payrolls, a raided express office, an intercepted cattle herd being driven north by speculators who'd cheated native families out of grazing rights owed them by treaty, and a bold daylight raid on a bank that had spent the previous 2 years foreclosing on small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during a bad economic panic. The vault was emptied. The foreclosure records were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to those very properties began arriving, quietly, in the mail of the families who'd lost them, accompanied by notarized statements claiming the bank had reconsidered. The notary stamps were forged. The deeds themselves, somehow, were real, transferred properly through the county recorder's office by someone with a working knowledge of the law and a clerk who had been persuaded, one way or another, to cooperate. The bank tried to challenge the transfers in court and lost. Ruined by both the theft and the publicity, it closed its doors within the year. The families kept their land. Marcus Kane, reading these reports back at his desk, began, by his own later admission, to feel something close to admiration for the man he'd been sent to destroy, an admiration he found both morally uncomfortable and professionally dangerous. He began to understand why Cross had become something like a folk hero across that country. Why songs about him, sung first by black families in the Cotton Bottoms, had started to spread into the cattle camps and the railroad crews. Why even some of the white settlers, the small farmers and broken-down veterans the war had ruined just as thoroughly, had started to see Cross less as an outlaw and more as a man clawing back some small piece of what had been taken from everyone who hadn't landed on the winning side of the new economy. Kane understood all of that. He also understood his job hadn't changed. In the summer of 1869, he made his first serious attempt to end it. A force of 40 men, agency riders, a company of Texas Rangers, and federal deputies, well armed and well mounted, acting on a tip from a turned informant who claimed to know the location of the band's hidden camp deep in a range the legend calls the Talon Mountains, reachable only through a single narrow pass the band kept watched around the clock. They rode out to meet their informant at a crossroads. They found him sitting against a tree, hands bound, throat cut, eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt, the King of Spades. Kane understood immediately. The informant had been playing both sides, feeding federal money while reporting everything straight back to Cross, who had used him to walk an entire armed column straight into a trap. The attack came at moonrise. Survivors would say afterward that they never again heard hoofbeats on pine needles, or smelled wood smoke on a summer night, without the hair on their arms standing straight up. It hit from every direction at once, from positions clearly chosen days in advance, catching the column in a crossfire in a small clearing ringed by dense timber. The first volley alone dropped 6 men. The Rangers' commanding officer, a famously aggressive fighter, tried to lead a charge into the trees and was shot through the neck before he'd gone 5 steps, bleeding out slowly while his own men, pinned down, could do nothing but watch. At some point, a voice, Cross's, or someone speaking for him, called out from the dark, telling the men to lay down their arms and stand up empty-handed, and they would not be killed. Kane, bleeding from a shoulder wound that nearly finished him, gave the order to surrender. The fight lasted under an hour. 16 of the 40 were dead. A dozen more wounded. The survivors, Kane included, were stripped of weapons, horses, and even their uniforms, and left to walk 40 miles home in their underclothes. Not one member of Cross's band, as far as anyone could tell, had so much as been scratched. When Kane finally staggered back into the outpost days later, sunburned and half-dead from thirst, a scrap of paper was still pinned to his bare chest, carrying the same 5 words as before. The local marshal fired off an urgent request to Washington for a full regiment of cavalry to clear the territory once and for all. The request was denied, and the reasons behind that denial wouldn't become clear for decades. The truth was that Cross's operations had become tangled up in a much larger and far more delicate political knot, the fragile question of native sovereignty in the territory, the government's own catastrophic failure to protect the people it had freed, and a very real fear that sending soldiers in to hunt down a band that included Comanche riders, a band openly protected by tribal government, could ignite a war the authorities were desperate to avoid. Worse, from Washington's point of view, a public campaign against Cross risked drawing national attention to just how badly the government was failing the very people it claimed to have liberated. Cross was an embarrassment. Soldiers would only make him a martyr. Better, the thinking went, to let the agency handle it quietly, out of the papers, and hope the whole thing eventually wore itself down through the slow grind of arrests, betrayals, and time, the way most outlaw bands eventually did. Kane, having nearly died in those mountains, accepted his new orders with the grim understanding of a man who finally saw clearly just what kind of country he was working for. What followed was nearly 3 years of a strange, slow, mostly invisible war, fought out across canyons and river bottoms and small towns throughout the territory. The band kept operating, surgical, unpredictable, never hitting the same target twice, never taking more life than the job demanded, always leaving behind their cards and their tagged warnings. 2 more bank vaults. 3 more railroad payrolls. An army supply wagon carrying tens of thousands in cash. And, most famously, a riverboat robbed at a wood landing in the fall of 1870, netting close to $90,000 in cash and bullion bound for a group of cotton buyers downriver. Every time, the money vanished into the same network, hidden caves, sympathetic townsfolk, quietly bribed officials stretched across 3 states. Every time, within weeks, unmarked packages of cash, returned deeds, and long-lost livestock started showing up on the doorsteps of freedmen families, dispossessed native families, ruined small farmers, and displaced Mexican families alike, with no note and no explanation. Cross had built, in effect, a whole shadow economy, funded by taking from the largest concentrations of wealth in that new post-war world, and run through a web of mutual aid that crossed every line of race and language the region had. Marcus Kane understood all of it. And the more he understood, the more he found himself, against his will, against his orders, quietly admiring the very man he'd been sent to bring down. He wrote, in a journal his family would find generations later, that Elijah Cross was the most dangerous man in the territory. Not because of the killing. Because he was proving, publicly, that another kind of world was possible, and that people would die to defend it. Just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any stranger, it did. If this tale's giving you chills, share it with someone who loves a good mystery, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Let's keep going. The thing that finally broke the band wasn't betrayal, though there were plenty of attempted betrayals along the way. It wasn't military force either, though Kane kept assembling and dispatching new attempts with grim regularity. In the end, it was something far more human, a mixture of love and a fatal miscalculation, the same combination that has quietly ended more resistance movements throughout history than any army ever has. In the spring of 1872, Selah Vance was pregnant. The father was Elijah Cross himself, with whom she'd been secretly involved, family legend says, since at least 1868, a relationship kept hidden even from most of the band, partly because Cross believed personal attachments made a man vulnerable, and partly because Selah herself had always insisted on riding as an equal commander, never as anyone's wife. The pregnancy changed everything. Cross, who had survived slavery, war, and years as the most hunted man in that stretch of the country, found himself facing something he'd never once let himself imagine, a future. A child. A family. By that summer, the two of them had quietly begun planning to step back, not to abandon the network entirely, but to shift into a quieter, advisory role, handing the day-to-day leadership over to younger riders like Titus Merrow and a young Comanche fighter, Tall Elk's nephew. Cross and Selah would resettle, under Amos Reed's name, on a small farm that had been quietly purchased in the nation, and try, for whatever years they had left, to live like ordinary people. It was a beautiful plan. It was also, as Cross himself likely knew, a plan no man in his position had any real right to make. The plan came to Marcus Kane's attention that fall through a stroke of luck so improbable that Kane himself, in his private writing, credited it to the direct intervention of a god he hadn't much believed in before. A man arrested on an unrelated charge, hoping to buy his own freedom, mentioned in passing a deed he'd heard about, a small farm recently registered under Amos Reed's name. The man had no idea who Reed was, or why the information mattered. He was simply trying to trade gossip for leniency. Kane recognized the name instantly. It was the first solid link anyone had ever found between Cross's network and an actual, fixed piece of property. He pulled the thread. What came loose was the whole pattern: the farm's purchase traced back through a freight agent, a merchant, a saloon keeper, revealing, piece by piece, the entire quiet commercial infrastructure that had kept the band supplied and hidden for 4 years. Kane didn't move on any of it. He watched. He waited. He documented everything. By early 1873, he'd assembled a list of nearly 150 people across 3 states who were materially tied to Cross's operation, and he'd pinpointed, with real confidence, the location of the farm where Cross and Selah planned to settle once their child was born. Then Kane did something no agent in his position had done before. He went over the heads of the field operation entirely, laid the whole case out to the agency's own leadership, and made his argument: any attempt to destroy the network by force, even now, with everything he knew, would only create martyrs and harden a loose, sprawling web of quiet sympathizers into a permanent, unstoppable insurgency. He proposed something else instead. He proposed an offer. The offer, delivered through a trusted intermediary in the spring of 1873, was this: Cross and Selah could keep the farm. They could keep their unborn child. They would receive full, signed federal pardons covering every act committed by the band during its years of operation. In exchange, they would disband the network, retire from resistance entirely, and use whatever moral authority they still carried among the freedmen and native communities of the territory to discourage anyone from picking up where they left off. In plain terms, they would step aside. The intermediary was Amos Reed, held quietly in protective custody for 2 months, treated well, fed at the marshal's own table, allowed to write to his family, and also told, in the plainest possible terms, exactly what would happen to the network of 150 people, including his own wife and children, if the offer was refused. Reed carried the offer into the mountains himself and delivered it to Cross in person on a cold evening in March 1873. What passed between them that night was never written down. Reed himself, family legend holds, refused for the rest of his long life to discuss it with anyone outside a small circle, and the handful of people he did finally tell died without ever putting it to paper. What is known, what the legend agrees on, is that Cross accepted. He understood, the way Kane had hoped he would, that refusing would cost his own pride nothing but would cost everything for the 150 people who had stood behind him for 5 years. He decided he had no right to make them pay that price. The meeting was set for a remote cabin near the border, on the night of April 17, 1873. Cross would come alone. Kane would come alone. A respected tribal judge, along with Amos Reed, would witness the signing and stand as guarantors of good faith. Cross arrived at midnight, unarmed, riding in as a gesture of trust. Kane was waiting. The pardons were signed. The 2 men shared a bottle of whiskey, the first time, Cross was said to remark, he'd ever had a drink with a lawman. They talked for hours, about the war, the territory, what might come next. Kane wrote later that Cross spoke of his unborn child with a tenderness that seemed impossible to square with a man who had, by then, been responsible for the deaths of dozens. At one point, the legend says, Cross asked Kane plainly whether he believed the pardon would actually hold, whether some ambitious official, years down the line, might simply tear it up. Kane answered honestly that he didn't know. He'd done everything in his power to make the agreement binding, but the government, he said, was not exactly famous for keeping its promises to black men or native people, and Cross would be a fool to put too much faith in a piece of paper out of Washington. Cross only smiled, a small, private smile Kane said he never forgot, and said that he was tired. That he'd been tired for 10 years. That a foolish trust, he'd decided, was better than the alternative, a lifetime spent running, and a son raised expecting, someday, to be killed the same way his father and grandfather nearly had been. He said he'd made his peace with the chance that the pardon might not hold. That if it didn't, at least he would have tried. That he wasn't giving up the fight for the farm, or the pardon itself, he was giving it up for the small chance of a life that wasn't shaped entirely around the expectation of violence. They parted before sunrise. Cross rode north, back toward the farm where Selah was waiting. Cain rode east, the signed agreement tucked in his saddlebag. What happened next was something neither man had any way to foresee, and it proved, with brutal finality, that the network Cross had built was never entirely his to control, and maybe never had been. A separate posse, 17 men, made up of agency riders, rangers, and local deputies who had picked up Cross's trail days earlier under older orders to bring him in dead or alive, had no idea a deal had ever been struck. They'd closed in on the cabin just as Cross was riding away from it at dawn. They caught him at mid-morning in a shallow ravine, 12 miles south of the river, unarmed as a mark of good faith. They surrounded him. He raised his hands and showed them the signed pardon. The posse's leader, a hard-edged ranger captain remembered in the legend as Silas Rourke, took the paper, read it, and threw it in the dirt. His orders, he said, came from the state and from the ranchers' associations that paid his wages, not from any pardon signed in Washington. He gave Cross 30 seconds to arm himself. Cross, unarmed, simply stood there. Rourke shot him through the chest from 12 feet away. Cross fell. Rourke dismounted, walked over, and put a second shot through his head. He ordered the body strung up as a warning, and the posse rode on, not knowing, not for another 2 days, exactly what they had done. Titus Merrow reached the body first, alerted by a scout who'd shadowed Cross since he'd left the meeting. He cut the body down and buried it in a place the legend says has never been found. Then he sent riders out in every direction, carrying nothing but a date, a location, and a deck of cards with 17 specific cards missing. The people who received that message understood exactly what was being asked of them. Within 6 weeks, every man who had ridden in the posse that killed Elijah Cross, Silas Rourke included, had been hunted down and killed, each one shot once between the eyes, each one left holding one of the missing cards. Combined and read in the order the men died, the cards spelled out, in a code built on an old counting system, for simple words, "This debt is paid." Marcus Cain, once he understood what had happened, requested, and this time was denied, a leave of absence from the agency. He wrote a long letter of resignation, explaining that he could no longer serve an organization that had used him, without his knowledge, to lure a man to his death under a false promise of safety. His resignation was refused. He was told, in a private meeting he later wrote about at length, that Rourke had never technically been acting under sanctioned orders, and that the agency, in the narrowest legal sense, bore no responsibility. Cain understood that this was true in the smallest possible reading of the facts, and false in every way that mattered. He understood that a government which had failed to coordinate its own agents, failed to communicate its own pardon, and, at bottom, never really wanted Cross to survive, had killed him just as surely as Rourke's bullets had. He stayed at the agency because he had a family to feed and nowhere else to go, but he never took another case in that territory, and he never spoke to the men above him again except through others. He died decades later, in a northern city, of pneumonia, and family legend says his last words were a single name, spoken twice, Elijah. So what became of Selah Vance, and the child she was carrying? What became of the 150 people who'd quietly kept the network alive for 5 years? What became of the little farm where Cross had hoped, for the first time in his life, to simply live? The answers survive only in pieces, in family memory, in oral tradition passed down through freedmen, native, and Mexican communities across that country, and they've never been fully pieced together, and likely never will be. Selah gave birth to a son that May. She named him Elijah, after his father. Within a month, she'd left the territory entirely, traveling first south and then, by ship, to West Africa, joining a small community of black expatriates who had spent half a century trying to build a free republic of their own on that coast. She lived there the rest of her life under a version of Cross's name, and by the legend's telling, died there in 1904. Her son grew up abroad, was educated, trained as a lawyer, and eventually returned to the United States, where he quietly became one of the early organizers behind what would grow into one of the most important civil rights organizations in the country's history. He lived out his life without ever publicly naming his father, though he was said to have written, in a private letter to his own son, that his mother had told him the whole story when he was 12 years old, and that he had carried it with him every day afterward. The network of 150 people was never prosecuted. Marcus Kane, in what he considered the last honest act of his career, burned the list himself in a hotel fireplace the week he learned Cross was dead. The names existed nowhere else. Every one of those people lived out ordinary lives on their farms and in their towns, and the part they'd played stayed, for most of them, a secret shared only with their own children and grandchildren, late at night, when the wider world wasn't listening. The little farm burned to the ground a couple of years later, torched by night riders who'd heard a rumor about who it once belonged to. The land was later sold off for unpaid taxes to a settler from up north who had no idea what he was buying. When he plowed the south field that first spring, he turned up a small leather pouch buried just beneath the surface, 20 gold coins, the last of that old stagecoach gold Cross had buried on the land he'd hoped, someday, to call home. Maybe it was insurance. Maybe it was just the habit of a man who'd spent his whole life expecting everything could be taken from him without warning. The settler sold the gold, bought a team of mules, and lived out a long, quiet life on the very ground where Elijah Cross had once hoped to raise his son, never knowing, to his dying day, what he'd stumbled onto. The story of Elijah Cross, the runaway who built the most feared, most quietly beloved band the territory ever saw, never made it into the official version of how the West was won. There was no room, in the story most people were taught, for a black man on horseback with a repeating rifle and 150 people across 3 states willing to risk everything to protect him. But the story survived anyway, the way these stories do, in songs still sung by families who don't always know exactly what they mean anymore, in old playing cards that occasionally turn up in antique shops with strange markings on the back, and in a small unmarked stone in a forgotten cemetery, decorated every April with a bouquet of wild prairie flowers, left by hands nobody has ever seen, and that, after a century and a half, must by now belong to the great-great-grandchildren of the people, who knew the truth and simply refused to let it disappear. Whatever you want to call this one, legend, folk tale, a story passed down and shaped a little differently in every generation that told it, it points at something real, that the history we're handed is rarely the whole history, and that the most dangerous people in any story are usually the ones who refuse to accept that the world in front of them is the only world that could exist. So tell me, what do you make of this one? Outlaw, hero, or something in between that doesn't fit neatly into either word? Drop your take in the comments below. And if you're the kind of person who loves a story like this, go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell, and pass it along to someone who'd love it too. See you in the next one.